I came home 2 days early from my business trip. No call. No warning. I unlocked my own front door and found my husband and my sister tangled in our bed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I turned around, walked back out, got in my car, and called my lawyer first. My name is Winterly Cross, and before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something about me. I have never once in my life reacted to pain the way people expect me to. When my father died, I didn't cry at the funeral. I cried 3 weeks later, alone in his garden, holding a pair of pruning shears he used every Sunday morning. When my first business failed, I didn't panic. I sat down, made a list, and started over. So when I stood in the hallway of my own house, keys still in my hand, listening to the sounds coming from behind my bedroom door, some part of me simply switched into a different gear. The part that survives, the part that plans. I want to take you back a little further, though, because betrayal never starts in the bedroom. It starts months before, in 100 small moments you talk yourself out of noticing. I met Beckett Sorrell 8 years ago at a marketing conference in Denver. He was charming in that easy, low-effort way some men are, the kind of charm that makes you feel like you're the only interesting person in the room, right up until you realize he says the exact same things to everyone. I didn't see that then. Then, I saw a man who listened when I talked about my business, who remembered the names of my clients, who showed up at my father's hospital room with coffee and sat with me for 6 hours without complaining once. We got married 2 years later, in my father's backyard, under the maple tree he'd planted the year I was born. My father passed 18 months after that. He left me the house, the same house Beckett and I were living in, free and clear, in my name only. My father was old-fashioned in some ways and sharp as a blade in others, and he told me once, before he got sick, Winterly, a house should always belong to the person who can't be talked out of keeping it. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I do now. My younger sister, Quinley, was a different story entirely. She was 5 years behind me, and where I'd always been the responsible one, the one who paid bills on time, who built a business from nothing, who took care of our parents when they needed it, Quinley drifted. She changed careers 4 times before she was 30. She dated men who never lasted past the 6-month mark. She borrowed money from me twice and paid it back neither time, and I let it go both times because she was my sister, and because some old, stubborn part of me kept hoping she'd land somewhere solid. I run a branding and design studio. It's taken me 12 years to build it into something real. 16 employees, a client roster I'm proud of, contracts with 3 regional retail chains. Beckett worked in commercial real estate, doing well enough, though never quite as well as he told people at parties. Quinley worked, off and on, for a florist 2 towns over. On paper, we were an ordinary family. Underneath, something had been rotting quietly for longer than I wanted to admit. Looking back, there were signs. Quinley started showing up at our house more often, just to say hi, she'd say, always somehow time for afternoons when I had client meetings and Beckett was home early. Beckett started taking his phone into the bathroom, into the garage, out to the mailbox for calls that used to happen in the living room in front of me. He started remembering small details about Quinley's schedule that a brother-in-law shouldn't remember, which days she had off, what her new therapist's office looked like, what she'd ordered at a restaurant I never went to with them. I noticed. I want to be honest about that. I noticed and I told myself I was being paranoid because the alternative was too large and too ugly to hold in my hands while I was also trying to run a company, plan a product launch, and manage a renovation on the guest bathroom. It is a strange, humbling thing, realizing later how much evidence you quietly filed away under probably nothing. There was a dinner, about 4 months before everything came apart, where I almost said something out loud. We were at a restaurant downtown, the 3 of us, because Quinley had just gone through another breakup, and Beckett had insisted we invite her along, so she wouldn't sit home alone. Halfway through the meal, I watched Beckett reach across the table and adjust the napkin in Quinley's lap. A small, automatic gesture, the kind of thing you do for someone you've touched 1,000 times before, not the kind of thing you do for your wife's little sister. I remember the exact half-second of stillness that followed, the way Quinley's eyes flicked toward me and then away, too quickly. I told myself I'd imagine the weight of it. I ordered dessert. I paid the bill on my card because Beckett had forgotten his wallet, which had started happening with a frequency I hadn't yet allowed myself to add up. There was also a weekend, 2 months before, when Beckett told me he was going fishing with a college friend named Holloway I had never once met in 8 years of marriage, and Quinley told our mother, separately, that she was taking a solo trip to clear her head after a breakup. Neither of them mentioned the other. I only put that piece together much later, staring at a calendar, counting backward, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I share these details not to punish myself for missing them, but because I think anyone who has lived through betrayal knows this part of the story too, the quiet archive of moments that only make sense once you have the final piece of the puzzle in your hand. Before that, they're just static. Afterward, they're evidence. The business trip that changed everything was supposed to be 5 days in Charlotte, meeting with a retail client about a rebrand. I'd built in extra time because these meetings always ran long. But the client canceled the final 2 days, a scheduling conflict on their end, and instead of booking a later flight and wasting 2 days in a hotel, I changed my ticket and came home early. I didn't call ahead. Why would I? It was my own house. I remember the drive from the airport clearly, the ordinary, boring clarity of a day that has no idea it's about to break in half. I remember thinking I'd surprise Beckett, maybe suggest we go to that new restaurant downtown he'd mentioned wanting to try. I remember turning my key in the lock, stepping into the entryway, setting my suitcase down quietly so I wouldn't startle him if he was working from his office upstairs. The house was too quiet in a particular way. Not empty quiet, occupied quiet. I noticed Beckett's car key sitting in the ceramic bowl by the door, which meant he was home, and I noticed a pair of shoes by the stairs that weren't mine and weren't his, small. Familiar shoes I recognized instantly because I'd helped Quinley pick them out at an outlet mall 2 winters earlier. My mind, in that half-second, tried very hard to build a harmless explanation. Maybe she'd stopped by to drop something off. Maybe she was upstairs helping him look for something in a closet. I climbed the stairs quietly, still half convinced I was about to walk into an ordinary, boring Tuesday afternoon. And then I heard it. Voices, low and unmistakable, coming from upstairs. From our bedroom. I want to spare you the details of what I saw when I reached the top of the stairs and pushed the door open, because some images don't need repeating to be understood. I will tell you that my sister's coat was on the chair where I usually sat to put on my shoes. I will tell you that neither of them heard me until it was too late to pretend otherwise. I will tell you that Beckett said my name like it was a question, like he genuinely believed there might be a version of this moment where I'd accept an explanation. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I turned around, walked back downstairs, stepped outside, got in my car, and drove away without saying a single word. Let them figure out what to say to each other once they realized I was already gone. I stood by my car in the driveway for a moment before getting in, and something in me noted, almost clinically, that I had never in my life felt so calm while my entire world rearranged itself around me. I remember looking down at my own hands and thinking, absurdly, that my fingernails needed a fresh coat of polish, as though my brain had decided the only safe thing to focus on was something small and manageable. Then I got behind the wheel and let my hands finally shake, just for a moment, before I made myself stop. Then I called my lawyer. Her name is Rosalind Achabe, and I'd retained her 4 years earlier for an unrelated business dispute with a former vendor. I called her from my car, sitting in my own driveway, engine off, and I said, "Rosalind, I need to know what to do, and I need to know it in the next 10 minutes, because I am about to become either extremely calm or extremely reckless, and I would like your professional opinion on which one serves me better." She told me to do exactly what I'd already done. Leave. Don't confront. Don't destroy anything. Don't say anything in writing or in person that could be used against me later, and document everything I could remember about what I'd seen, with a timestamp, the moment I had privacy to do it. The version of you that reacts in the first hour, she said, is never the version that wins in the end. Before I left the driveway, Rosalind also told me to call a locksmith the next morning, since I had no intention of walking back into that house until the locks were changed. "It's your house," she reminded me. "You are not obligated to make this comfortable for him." I did exactly that. 2 mornings later, while Beckett was at work, I had every lock on the house rekeyed, and I stood in my own driveway watching a stranger in a work van drill new pins into the front door of the home my father had left me, feeling something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the beginning of getting my footing back. Beckett called the moment he discovered his key no longer worked, furious in a way that told me everything about what he'd assumed he was still entitled to. I let that call go to voicemail, too. I drove to a hotel 11 minutes from my own house and sat on the edge of the bed and wrote down everything. The time I walked in, the shoes by the stairs, the exact words Beckett said, what I remembered from the room, the fact that Quinley's car had been parked 1 street over instead of in our driveway, which told me this wasn't the first time and they knew enough to hide it. That last detail sat with me the longest. They had a system, a parked 1 street over system, which meant this had been going on long enough to develop habits. Beckett called 41 times that first night. I didn't answer any of them. Quinley called 8 times, then sent a long text message that began with, "It's not what you think," a sentence I have come to believe should be permanently banned from the English language because it is never, ever followed by something better than what you already think. I stayed at the hotel for 4 days. On the second night, I finally called my closest friend, a woman named Calantha Bishop I'd known since our first year of college, and I said 4 words into the phone before my voice gave out for the first time since it happened. "They took everything, Cal." She didn't ask questions. She showed up at my hotel room 40 minutes later with a bag of takeout neither of us touched and sat with me until 2 in the morning, not offering advice, just presence, the way good friends know how to do when advice would only get in the way of the work of simply surviving the night. It was Calantha who reminded me, somewhere around midnight, that I had built an entire company out of nothing after my father died, and that whatever came next, I already knew how to build things back up from a pile of rubble. I didn't believe her that night. I believe her now. In that same window of time, Rosalind helped me start the process that would define the next several months of my life. Not out of vengeance, though I won't pretend some small, honest part of me didn't want that too, but out of the practical, unglamorous work of protecting what was mine. The first thing we did was confirm what I already suspected about the house. It was titled solely in my name, inherited outright from my father's estate, with none of Beckett's income ever used toward its mortgage, taxes, or upkeep in any legally significant way. That single fact, my father's stubborn insistence on keeping the deed clean, turned out to be the sturdiest piece of ground I had to stand on. The second thing we did was pull our joint financial accounts. This is where the story stopped being simply a story about a broken marriage and turned into something else entirely. Over the previous 14 months, a total of just under $52,000 had moved out of a joint investment account Beckett and I had opened years earlier for retirement savings, an account I rarely checked closely because I trusted him to manage it and because I was busy running a company that required every ounce of my attention. The withdrawals were structured in amounts just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic verification call from the bank. Small, patient, deliberate movements. Not the kind of thing a man does in a moment of weakness. The kind of thing a man does with a plan. When my forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Markellen Oduya, whom Rosalind brought in during the second week, traced where the money had gone, the picture became even clearer. A portion had gone toward a rented condominium 2 towns over, the same town where Quinley worked at the florist. Records showed the lease had been signed 11 months earlier, under Beckett's name alone, paid for almost entirely with funds pulled from our joint account. Another portion had gone toward what looked like a series of gifts and payments connected to my sister directly. A car repair, a security deposit, a designer handbag purchase that showed up on a card statement the same week Quinley posted a photo of a new bag online, captioned only with a heart emoji. They hadn't just been having an affair. They'd been quietly building an entire second life together, funded by money that was supposed to be my future. The final piece, the one that made my stomach turn in a way even the bedroom scene hadn't managed to do, came from a document Mark Helen flagged almost by accident while reviewing our mortgage file for unrelated verification purposes. 6 months earlier, someone had attempted to submit a quitclaim deed to the county recording office, trying to add Beckett's name to the title of my father's house, citing a supposed home equity improvement loan that had never actually been used for any renovation on the property. The paperwork had been caught during the recording office's standard verification process before it was ever finalized, flagged for a signature discrepancy, and held pending review, then quietly forgotten in a backlog of paused filings until Mark Helen stumbled onto it. The signature on the request, my signature, was not mine. It had been forged. I sat with that piece of information for a long time before I could speak about it out loud. This wasn't only a man who had fallen out of love with me and into an affair with my sister. This was a man who had been quietly, patiently trying to take my father's house out from under me while I was at work building the life that paid for the roof over both our heads. "Walk me through it again," I finally said to Mark Helen, because some part of me needed to hear the timeline a second time before I could accept it as real. She pulled up the recording office's filing log on her laptop and turned the screen toward me. The request had been submitted on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, while I was at a client pitch 2 states away. The notary, listed on the form, worked out of a strip mall office I had never once set foot in, and the clerk who processed the intake had flagged the signature as inconsistent with the one already on file for the property, which was why the transfer had stalled instead of going through. My signature, when I compared it side by side with the document I'd actually signed that same month, wasn't even a particularly good forgery. The loops on the W were wrong, rushed, a stranger's approximation of my handwriting rather than a careful copy. It hadn't been good enough to pass a careful review. It had only ever needed to slip past a busy afternoon, and it hadn't even managed that. "He was betting on you never looking closely at the title file," Mark Helen said quietly. "Most people don't. Most people trust the person they're married to enough not to check." She wasn't being unkind. She was simply naming the exact vulnerability Beckett had spent over a year quietly exploiting. Rosalind's face, when she laid it out for me across her desk, was calmer than mine. "This is good," she said, and I must have looked at her like she'd lost her mind, because she clarified quickly. "Not good that it happened. Good that we can prove it. A forged signature on a title document is not a marital dispute. Winterly. That's fraud. That changes everything about the leverage you have." We reported the forged deed attempt to the title company and to the appropriate state fraud division, which opened a formal inquiry. We filed a civil complaint against Beckett for the misappropriated joint funds, with Mark Helen's financial trail as supporting documentation. And we began the divorce process, with Rosalind structuring the settlement demands around what the evidence actually showed rather than around what I felt, which she reminded me, gently but firmly, were 2 very different engines to run a case on. Beckett tried, at first, to make this about emotion. He sent messages about how sorry he was, how it just happened, how he still loved me despite everything. Then, when he realized the financial investigation was moving forward regardless of how sorry he sounded, his tone shifted into something colder, accusations that I was being vindictive, that I was ruining his life over a mistake. I stopped reading past the first line of most of his messages after that. Rosalind had warned me this would happen. People who are caught rarely apologize for long before they start looking for someone to blame for the consequences. There was one mediation session, roughly 2 months into the proceedings, where Beckett insisted on speaking directly to me instead of through counsel, and the mediator, against Rosalind's visible reluctance, allowed it for a few minutes in the interest of moving the process along. Beckett looked smaller across that conference table than I remembered him being in our own kitchen. He said he still didn't understand why I was escalating things, instead of just letting us handle this like adults. I asked him, calmly, whether forging my signature on a title document was also a matter of handling things like adults, and I watched something drain out of his face when he realized I already had the paperwork sitting in a folder in front of me. He didn't have an answer. Rosalind ended the session shortly after that, and it was the last time Beckett attempted to speak to me directly in any room for the remainder of the case. He also, against every piece of advice a reasonable person would follow, showed up outside my studio twice in 1 week, waiting in the parking lot after hours, trying to talk to me in person after I'd made clear through my attorney that all communication needed to go through counsel. The second time, one of my employees, a sharp young project manager named Fable Winthrop, saw him pacing near my car for nearly 20 minutes and called me before I left the building, concerned enough that I called Rosalind on the spot. That pattern, contact after an explicit request to stop, occurring twice within 1 week, witnessed by a third party, became the basis for a no-contact order Rosalind filed on my behalf, which the court granted within days, given the documented fraud investigation already underway. Quinley, for her part, went quiet for almost 3 weeks. Then she called our mother, sobbing, asking for help, framing herself as a woman who'd fallen into something she couldn't control. My mother, to her enormous credit, called me first before responding to my sister at all. "Tell me everything," she said, before I say one word to her. I told her everything: the affair, the money, the forged signature on Dad's house. There was a long silence on the line after that, long enough that I asked if she was still there. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone very quiet and very steady, the way it used to when she was truly furious rather than simply upset. "Your father kept that deed clean for a reason," she said. "He always said money makes people show you who they really are eventually. I just never thought it would be her." My mother has never been a dramatic woman, but I heard something break in her voice that afternoon, a particular kind of grief reserved for discovering your youngest child helped dismantle your eldest child's life for a rented condominium and a handbag. My parents did not disown Quinley. That's not how real families work, no matter how satisfying it might sound in the moment, but something fundamental shifted. She was no longer invited to family gatherings without express, individual invitation from each person attending. My mother told her plainly that she would not be welcome in my presence, in my home, or at any event I was hosting, for as long as I wished that boundary to remain, and that this was not a punishment but a consequence she had built herself, brick by brick, month by month, for over a year. The first holiday without her at the table felt strange in a way I hadn't fully prepared for. My mother set the table for one fewer place than we'd used my entire adult life, and nobody mentioned it out loud, though I caught my father's old chair, the one Quinley usually sat beside, catching everyone's eye at some point during the meal. My aunt asked, quietly, in the kitchen while we washed dishes, whether I thought this would be permanent. I told her the truth, which was that I genuinely didn't know, and that for the first time in my life, I didn't feel obligated to have an answer ready for a question about my sister. The forensic and title fraud investigation took over the next 18 months to fully resolve, running alongside the divorce proceedings, as these things often do. In the end, Beckett was ordered to repay the misappropriated joint funds in full, structured as a court-mandated restitution schedule tied directly to his income, with the State Fraud Division separately pursuing charges related to the attempted deed transfer, a matter that, by the time it concluded, had cost him his real estate license entirely, since the licensing board takes a notably unforgiving view of agents found to have engaged in property document fraud, even fraud committed in a personal rather than professional capacity. Several months later, once his employer learned of a license revocation, he was let go. Word travels slowly but surely in a small professional community, and in the months after his termination, 2 former colleagues of his reached out to me directly, not out of gossip, but because they both had uneasy feelings about certain property transactions Beckett had handled over the years and wanted to know if the fraud finding changed how they should look back at old paperwork of their own. I couldn't offer them legal advice, but I gave them Rosalind's contact information, and I later heard, secondhand, that at least one of those inquiries turned into its own separate complaint filed with the same licensing board. Whatever pattern Beckett had built with me, it seems, wasn't entirely new. Rosalind called me the afternoon the licensing board issued its final decision on Beckett's real estate license, and I could hear something almost like satisfaction in her usually neutral voice as she read me the ruling summary over the phone. The board had found, based on the fraud division's referral and the documented forgery, that Beckett had violated the professional code of conduct governing property transactions, regardless of the fact that the fraudulent deed request had targeted his own household rather than a client's property. "They don't make exceptions for family," Rosalind told me. "A forged signature on a title document is the exact kind of thing that license exists to prevent, no matter whose name is on the deed." Beckett had 30 days to appeal. He didn't. The house remained fully and solely mine, the fraudulent title attempt formally voided and flagged permanently in county records, which Rosalind assured me would make any future attempt at a similar maneuver essentially impossible to execute quietly again. The divorce settlement, once finalized, included the full restitution amount, a clean and complete removal of Beckett's name from every joint account and any claim whatsoever on the property, and court-documented fees covering the entire cost of the forensic investigation, paid by him. I want to tell you honestly that none of us felt like triumph in the moment it happened. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely feels the way revenge fantasies promise it will. It felt like exhaustion. It felt like relief with a long, slow exhale attached to it. It felt like finally putting down something heavy I hadn't realized I had been carrying with both arms for over a year. What it also felt like, eventually, was clarity. I finished the guest bathroom renovation I'd shelved during the worst of it, the way I'd originally wanted, alone, exactly to my own taste, without a single compromise made for someone else's opinion of tile color. I expanded my studio's client roster that year more than any previous year in the company's history, maybe because there is a particular kind of focus available to a person who has stopped spending energy pretending not to notice things. I planted a new maple tree in the backyard, near my father's old one, the spring after the divorce was finalized, because some part of me needed a marker for the version of my life that came after. Calantha helped me move the last of Beckett's remaining belongings out of the house herself, boxing up the things he hadn't already collected, and when we finished, we sat on the back porch with 2 glasses of lemonade and watched the sun go down over a yard that finally, fully belonged only to me. She raised her glass and said, "To the house your father built you a fortress in without either of you knowing it." And I laughed for what felt like the first time in months, a real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere underneath the exhaustion. We stayed out there until the porch light drew moths and the lemonade had gone warm, talking about nothing important, which turned out to be exactly what I needed most. I also, eventually, stopped flinching every time my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, stopped double-checking the locks 3 times before bed, stopped waking at 3 in the morning replaying that hallway. Healing did not arrive as a single dramatic turning point. It arrived the way most real recoveries do, in small, unremarkable Tuesdays where I simply forgot, for a few hours at a stretch, to think about any of it at all. Quinley reached out again, months later, not with another apology soaked in self-pity, but with a short, plain message acknowledging, in specific terms, what she'd done and what it had cost. No excuses, no reframing, just an accounting of the facts as they actually happened. I haven't decided yet what, if anything, that opens the door to. Some doors, once locked from the outside, take a very long time to feel safe opening again, even a crack. I think about that afternoon often, the sound of my own key turning in the lock, the strange steadiness in my hands as I walked away instead of screaming. People sometimes tell me they admire how composed I stayed. I don't know if composed is the right word. I think, more than anything, some part of me had already been quietly preparing for this exact moment for longer than I wanted to admit, the way you brace for weather you felt coming in the air for days before the sky actually breaks. I've thought a great deal, since then, about what my father meant that afternoon in the garden. A house should belong to the person who can't be talked out of keeping it. I don't think he was only talking about property. I think he was talking about the parts of a person's life worth protecting fiercely enough that no one, not a husband, not a sister, not the slow erosion of 100 small excused moments, gets to quietly take them without a fight. I didn't scream that day, because screaming was never going to be the thing that got my house, my company, or my future back. Com did that. Documentation did that. A lawyer on speed dial, and a father who never let anyone talk him out of keeping what mattered did that. If you had unlocked that door and seen what I saw, Would you have turned around and called your lawyer first? Or would you have done something else entirely?